Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. The time has come to analyse the battles in The Return of the King. Let us quickly go through both the usual and specific disclaimers for this analysis, and then we'll dive right into it. I am not going to discuss the incredible feats and individual heroics of the characters. Why? Because it is part of generic convention that heroes and villains in stories are capable of feats and deeds which are beyond that of normal people. Audiences want heroes who are aspirational and inspirational, and they want villains who are competent and threatening. Some degree of plot armor is therefore essential to achieve these effects. As well, I don't want to do an analysis of this scene.
That still only counts as one!
I have read the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but I am not going to reference or use materials from the books to aid my assessments. This is a military analysis of the extended edition of the film, and not a review of the book. Of course, I may use clips and details from the other two films, The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers, where appropriate, because they are part of the same cinematic story. Now, this film does contain fantasy creatures such as elves, dwarves, ents, orcs, wargs, and trolls, and I shall only be making inferences and conclusions about their traits and abilities from what is portrayed or otherwise implied on the screen. Alright, we are ready to begin. Let's discuss a few things which take place in the film before the first battle. In the beginning of the film, at Isengard, Gandalf, but now in white, tells Théoden the Ready to be prepared for the enemy's next move.
Send word to all our allies, and to every corner of Middle-earth that still stands free. The enemy moves against us. We need to know where he will strike.
Yet, only a few scenes later, Théoden says words to the effect that he will refuse to ride to Minas Tirith if Gondor requests aid.
Tell me, why should we ride to the aid of those who did not come to ours? What do we owe Gondor?
Later, when Gondor does call for aid, Théoden the Ready is decidedly unready and hasn't made any moves to rally his forces, as he appears to be marshalling them in great haste, as if nothing was done to assemble them beforehand. Is there a reason why his army hasn't been assembled before? Surely most of his forces should be in or around the same location after the Battle of Helm's Deep. Additionally, Théoden never requested Gondor's aid, so why is he so bitter and angry that no Gondorian forces came to Helm's Deep?
Tell me, why should we ride to the aid of those who did not come to ours? What do we owe Gondor?
Let us now move to Minas Tirith. Denethor the Mad has no interest in seeking aid from Rohan because he knows Aragorn, the man who will be king of Gondor, would ride with them, and he wants to keep the throne, even if that means the whole of Gondor ends up burning with him. Calling Denethor mad is a bit charitable, to be honest. Petty, malicious, selfish, and insane are also very good titles for him. Fortunately, Gandalf and Pippin take care of the calling for aid part for Denethor the Mad, since his neurosis impedes his judgment. Now we can get to the first battle in the film, the Battle for Osgiliath. It starts with the orcs attempting a stealthy crossing over the river to the side occupied by the Gondorian forces, led by Faramir, the Unfavoured Son. There is mist and darkness to cover them, but the orcs choose to light torches and hold them as they cross the river. Presumably, they would rather not light said torches, but perhaps they need some light to see what they are doing, and so that they don't crash into each other. This would appear to run against scenes in the previous 2 films, which suggested that orcs have good vision in the dark. A Gondor soldier sees them crossing the river. His attention was probably caught by the flickering torches, but before he can sound the alarm, an orc archer looses an arrow into him. Now it pierces through his breastplate and into his chest, and just takes him out instantly. Everything I've read and seen, both on and offline, suggests that this is highly unlikely. An arrow from a simple longbow would likely not pierce through a breastplate such as this. In any case, the now dead soldier falls off his post, down a set of stairs, and into the Gondor camp. Now the alarm can be raised and a defensive line set up along the river to contest the landing and...
To the river! Quick!
The alarm is not raised as such. Instead, the Gondor troops try to stealthily get into position, hiding behind pillars and other ruins, some 10 to 20 feet away from the water. They even let some orcs run past them before they engage in combat. These 2 decisions are less than advisable. Let's go through the problems. The first problem is communication. Let's go back to the moment where this unfortunate watchman, who I'm going to call Phil, falls off the ruined tower into the centre of the camp. Now everyone in the vicinity of Phil knows that he is dead and has been shot by an orc arrow, including Faramir, the unfavoured son. Now Faramir begins whispering to his men to make their way to the river, and again, anyone in the vicinity of Phil can hear these orders. But what about the rest of the troops? I don't believe for a second that these are the only soldiers by the river. There must be other companies spread across it. Otherwise there'd be no defensive line, and being in this position would make no sense as it wouldn't be defensible. How is whispering supposed to alert the rest of the troops stationed along the river? What about those who are resting, or who are asleep? There is a reason that armies throughout history have used flags, horns, drums, bells, and just good old-fashioned shouting for communication. These are all good methods to communicate with lots of men quickly over medium to long distances. The second problem is effective defense. Why are Faramir and his men stationed at the river? Presumably, it is to stop orcs from crossing the river, considering that this stretch of water marks the border between friendly and enemy territory. Now, when it comes to military landings of this nature, there will always be debate as to whether a landing should be contested or whether it should be unopposed initially and then counterattacked. Faramir, the unfavoured son, is persuaded by the first party in this debate, but the manner in which he decides to contest the landing is extremely ineffective and, well, incompetent. He has men armed with shields, spears, and swords who are wearing decent armour. He has some rangers as well, who, although lightly armed, have bows. The best course of action would be to form some kind of shield wall between the pillars and the ruins, near to the water, to frustrate the landings and to cause queues in the river. I'm not joking about queues here. Look at these boats at the front. They cannot go anywhere until they have dropped off their orcs. But if said orcs are struggling to disembark from the boats because the landing is being contested, then these boats cannot go anywhere, meaning that there would be a queue in the river. Now, a queue of orcish boats, possibly ramming into each other and getting jammed while their passengers go mad with impatience, sounds like a very good outcome for the Gondor side. But Faramir orders his troops to stand back and lie in wait, and so gives the first wave of boats a chance to unload their orcs and leave without difficulty. This means the orcs get to do their landing basically unimpeded. Additionally, this decision runs counter to warfare in pre-modern times. Faramir's decision would make sense if his men were armed with machine guns and were waiting for the orcs to wander into prepared kill zones. But he and his men do not have modern weaponry. They have medieval weaponry, so they should adapt their tactics for those weapons, rather than for modern warfare. From the ancient periods onward to the late 1800s, armies fought in mass units, which often stood out in the open, shoulder to shoulder and back to back. The reason was because most battles were decided in the melee, and there are massive advantages to having your flanks and your rear defended by your friends when in a melee. The main advantage and benefit is that you are not so easily surrounded and beaten to death by a larger number of enemies. By deliberately not forming ranks, and not making his men stand shoulder to shoulder, Faramir dooms his men to fight one-on-one and couple-on-couple skirmishes against a force which appears to be larger than his. Indeed, the film even shows the consequences of his decision. We see the Gondor soldiers are fighting their own individual battles, and that they are far more vulnerable than they would otherwise be if they fought as a unit. For all these reasons, it is not surprising that the orcs overrun the remains of the city. Before moving on, I'd like to comment on the fighting in these scenes. I really like the portrayal of the one-on-one fights. The combatants are being thrown into walls, and there is a lot of what I want to describe as dirty wrestling. A lot of actual fighting does turn this dirty and brutal. Actual fighting is not clean, like in the boxing ring or the Hema ring, where everyone is a friend and doing it for fun, fitness and training. The Gondorian troops are forced to retreat to Minas Tirith, and Ugly declares that the age of men is over. The Gondorian troops all flee to the city on horseback. No infantry can be seen, which suggests they were all picked off by the Nazgul and their fell beasts. I do not believe every single defender had his own horse. These troops are, of course, saved from the Nazgul by Gandalf, but now in white. These same defenders later become attackers and ride back to Osgiliath to meet their deaths. This charge obviously was going to be suicidal for a number of reasons, but primarily because this cavalry force is small relative to the ruined city and its defending army, and dare I mention the fell beasts again. However, I still have to ask what the plan was going to be, as this is a cavalry brigade and nothing more. Ignoring the fell beasts and the overwhelming number of entrenched orcs, there was no way this assault was going to be effective if the plan was simply to charge in. A cavalry charge, not supported by infantry, is not the first tactic I would choose for taking a city of rubble. Yet this is the course of action chosen by Denethor and carried out by Faramir without any meaningful objection. It would appear that Denethor the Mad is mad, and that Faramir the Unfavoured Son is either suicidally depressed or sees the endeavour as
a chance for Faramir, Captain of Gondor, to show his quality.
The attempt to retake Osgiliath fails, and Faramir returns gravely wounded just as the siege begins. And Denethor the Mad, disappointed that his son has failed to show his quality, completely loses it in accordance with his namesake. He shrieks and screams, refuses to listen to reason, and shouts at everyone to flee, lowering the morale of every man within a 100-yard radius to rock bottom. Fortunately, Gandalf, but in white, quickly and effectively takes charge and saves morale at the crucial last minute. The orcs arrive and line up, and it appears that they haven't set up a camp, which is not great because they will need to eat and sleep somewhere if the siege lasts for more than one day, which it would in all probability. The orcs begin the siege by throwing the severed heads of captured prisoners over the walls to break the defenders' morale. Armies have done this historically. They then loose stones with their catapults and start pushing their siege towers towards the walls. The Gondor trebuchets on the top of the walls of Minas Tirith let loose in return, and are quite effective at destroying the siege towers being pushed towards them. Catapults on castle walls might seem like high fantasy, but they have appeared in history. The Nazgul, seeing the effectiveness of these trebuchets, ride on their fell beasts and destroy most of them. Gandalf, but now in white, previously used magic to get rid of them on the plains of Pelennor, but he doesn't do so here. Maybe his staff ran out of battery? To be fair to this siege, there really isn't much to criticise. The attackers and defenders are both taking rational actions, which warriors of previous ages would respect. The orcs are trying to breach the wall with their siege towers, and trying to cause as much damage as possible with their catapults, while the defenders are trying to stop the siege towers. The only thing which is ridiculous is that the orcs keep charging at the main gate without any kind of protection against arrows, and they die in vast numbers as a result. Are we to believe these orcs have no self-preservation instincts, or aren't intelligent enough to build a battering ram wagon with a roof? Later they bring out a massive battering ram called Grond to break down the gate. Why didn't they just wait for it? Why didn't Ugly tell them to hold back? In fact, considering their vast numbers, why didn't Ugly command his forces to wait until Grond had been pulled into position before beginning the assault? If they waited for Grond, they could apply pressure on not only the walls, but also the gate. And if one of these avenues succeeded, the other effort would be supported and more likely to succeed as well. Patience is apparently something that Ugly and the other orcs do not do. Now this is where, on the first disc of the special edition, it tells the viewer to change discs. So I'm going to take this moment to make a quick announcement. I am happy to announce that this year, on the 29th of February, I released the final book in the High Realm trilogy, The Return to High Realm. 7 years and 3 books later, I have finally finished my trilogy. There are audio previews of the first couple of chapters for each book on this channel, which will be linked below. If you want to buy the trilogy as 3 ebooks, you can buy them on any of the Amazon stores or on Kobo. If you want them in paperback, you can order them on Amazon. Links are below for anyone who is interested. The siege continues late into the night, and Grond gets to work. The sheer mass of Grond does break the door down, but not without multiple rams. Gandalf does what Faramir should have done earlier in the film, and orders the Gondorian soldiers to form a shield wall, and even forms lines of archers behind them to let loose into the attackers. If it wasn't for the armoured cave trolls, this formation would have likely held for some time. As events unfold, it doesn't even take till dawn before the first level is breached, and the men of Gondor have to fall back to the second level. The fighting quickly becomes desperate, as units appear to be separated during the retreat, and it doesn't look like a rearguard action was mounted. This is, of course, a big failure on Gandalf's part. A rearguard action needed to be made. Also, I just noticed while editing this section, why are the orcs still throwing rocks and burning projectiles into the city when their forces have already secured the gate and breached the wall in places? Does Ugly want to hit his own troops? Because this is how friendly fire happens. When dawn arrives, so do the Rohirrim. Now many speak well of a speech we're going to see later in the film, but for my money, this is the best speech, and the best example of morale-boosting leadership in the film. It's not just the speech, and Theoden the Ready's proactive attitude, it's how he incites his men into a war chant. After giving orders, delivering a speech, and running his blade among the spears of his riders, he rouses his soldiers by starting a battle cry. 3 times they all shout in unison, "Death!" From a morale perspective, this is brilliant, and would work in psyching up any force for battle. It is important for the riders' spirits, because they can all clearly see that they are outnumbered by the orcs. Theoden's actions here are simply excellent. But what is even better is that these actions would demoralise the enemy. Imagine you're an orc in these fields, and then you see a massive army of horsemen appear on the nearby hills, and as you prepare to meet their inevitable charge, you hear them shouting this. I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I would be terrified and would want to get away as quickly as possible. Ugly does his best to meet the charge. He organises his orcs into ranks, and orders the archers to let loose. But in truth, there was no way this charge was ever going to be broken by the arrows, and morale was simply not on the orcs' side. When the Rohirrim led by Theoden the Ready smash into the orc lines, the results are predictable. At this point in the film, the army of orcs is effectively broken into 2 halves. The first half is stuck in the city of Minas Tirith, fighting the Gondorian soldiers, while the second, which is outside on the fields of Pelennor, is forced to flee in the opposite direction by the Rohirrim. These orcs make to rally behind the Haradrim and their Mumakal, or Oliphants. Now, these Oliphants are massive. In fact, that's putting it too lightly. These elephants are a Carthaginian power fantasy. Just look at the things. Aside from trying to shoot them in the eyes with arrows, or trying to shoot the drivers, I'm really not sure how you could deal with these creatures. Certainly, I would never ever recommend charging at them head on, even for the purposes of showing Alpha Chad levels of dominance. But that is what Théoden the Ready orders his riders to do, because he is an Alpha Chad, and I am not. The results are horrendous and counterproductive for the Rohirrim. All these men die needlessly. I shouldn't need to explain why this is a bad decision from Théoden the Ready. Fortunately, the Rohirrim, after losing a lot of men and horses, do figure out how to take the Oliphants down, but this learning process did not have to be so painful. Nevertheless, the battle doesn't truly turn in the Men of the West's favour until Aragorn the Man Who Will Be King arrives with the army of the dead, and his dwarf and elf friends. Now, the great thing about having an army whose soldiers can't be killed is, they can't be killed. So the forces of good win by default, and Gondor is saved. However, the film shows terrible losses, including King Théoden the Ready. His loss would be grievous, as he was the leader, the king, of the Rohirrim, and a respected one. The blow to morale would be horrendous. Fortunately, Aragorn the Man Who Will Be King of Gondor is just as respected, and takes on the mantle of leadership for both Gondor and Rohan. Now, before we get to the Black Gates, we need to discuss the run-up to the battle. Gandalf, but now in white, Aragorn the Man Who Will Be King of Gondor, Éomer the Man Who Will Be King of Rohan, and this tag-along dwarf and elf know that the only way Sauron and his orcs can be defeated forever is by destroying the ring. They know that Frodo and Sam are likely in Mordor, and they are aware that there are 10,000 orcs surrounding Mount Doom. Knowing the difficulty that Frodo and Sam will face getting to Mount Doom with all those orcs surrounding the mountain, Aragorn suggests marching on the Black Gates to draw out those 10,000 orcs. In terms of strategy, it is a great risk. It is basically putting all your eggs in one basket, that basket being 2 hobbits. However, if you are ever in a position where you simply have to take a long shot, or where the plan simply is risky and there is no turning back, you should give it your all, because that is the only way to achieve success in such circumstances. No half measures would work here. That time passed at least one film ago. It's not an ideal situation, far from it, but this is the best course of action considering the bad circumstances. So let's skip forward to the Black Gates. Aragorn the Man Who Will Be King of Gondor succeeds in drawing out the orcs by killing Sauron's emissary, appropriately called the Mouth of Sauron. Arguably, killing the messenger is a heinous and dishonourable act, but considering this creature looks like an American caricature of an Englishman's smile, maybe this is just Aragorn being a dentist. Aragorn the Man Who Will Be King of Gondor makes this brilliant speech, and there may be a day when I break down why it is so good, but
It is not this day.
However, I think it is fair to say that the speech would have its intended effect. Now let's look at the arrangement for battle. Why hasn't Aragorn, the Man Who Will Be King of Gondor, formed a battle line? Does he want his troops to be surrounded and flanked on all sides like this? If he wanted to be completely surrounded, why didn't he pick the top of a hill to make his final stand? This is a mind-bogglingly terrible arrangement of his battle forces. Also, just as an aside, is there any reason he didn't bring any trebuchets? If the idea is to draw the orc armies out of Mordor, wouldn't it have made sense to bring some of these catapults to hurl rocks at the Black Gates in order to provoke them, just in case there wasn't a messenger for Aragorn to ruthlessly kill? Anyway, back to the Men of the West's position in the battlefield. It would still be possible to mount a goodish defence here, even in this predicament. However, Aragorn orders his troops to charge. Well, actually, he just charges, and fortunately his army gets the idea and follows him. I don't think charging is the best decision here, especially as there was no need to charge. The orcs were already coming out and were already intent on fighting. So what is the strategic and tactical purpose here? If the idea was always to charge, why did Aragorn have the Rohirrim dismount their horses? What Aragorn should have done was form a battle line in the beginning, and then waited for the orcs to charge instead. But in spite of these less than optimal decisions, the operation is successful. Frodo and Sam take the ring to Mount Doom, and it is destroyed, and the subsequent victory is total. Aragorn is finally crowned King of Gondor, and the hobbits go home to the Shire. So that concludes the return of the king, and the battles in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This video has been a little shorter than my previous military analysis. Despite the minute difference in time length, which may suggest otherwise, I would say The Return of the King is a lot less complicated than The Two Towers, and because the main battle, the Siege of Minas Tirith, is conducted a lot more competently than the Siege of Helm's Deep. The Siege of Helm's Deep is the greater cinematic spectacle, but the Siege of Minas Tirith is carried out with much more competence by the orcs led by Gothmog and the Witch King. The truth is, there's little to criticise about the battles in The Return of the King, because the tactics and strategies are mostly sensible. So does this mean that The Return of the King is my favourite Lord of the Rings film? Well, actually my favourite is The Fellowship of the Ring, which really is just individual heroics, but out of the two films I have made videos on, I would say The Two Towers is my favourite, which is not to say I don't like The Return of the King, although it never fails to grind my gears that the Scouring of the Shire is not in the film. It's just to say that I have always enjoyed The Two Towers more. This may surprise some in my audience, because I did spend a great amount of time criticising the Siege of the Hornburg in The Two Towers. It is here I must confess that I don't believe perfectly sensible military strategy is what makes a film good or bad. A good film with terrible military strategy may not reach the heights of greatness, but a bad film will never be elevated onto the podium of good by competent military writing. Consider The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. I made videos on both films where I explained how their military writing is terrible. If we imagine a hypothetical alternate dimension where the military writing was good in both films, they would still be awful. The faults of the two films don't begin and end with the poor military writing. The military writing is simply the tip of the iceberg. Good military writing would not save these films in any universe. Of course, I still think it is important for stories to have good military strategy, but it often won't make or break a film to take some liberties, either for storytelling, cinematic, or rule of cool reasons. However, I would politely insist that it is important to know the rules before you bend them. That's it from me, ladies and gentlemen. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day.